The dust of the redemption livestock market was a fine biblical powder, a substance of pure despair. It coated Thorn Shepherd's throat, settled in the creases of his sun-cracked skin, and filmed over his eyes until the world shimmered with the heat of his own failure. It was the dust of his father's dreams turning to ash, the grit of a legacy ground down to nothing. He stood with his back pressed against a splintered corral fence, the wood a familiar agony against his spine, and watched the auctioneer's hammer fall like a judge's gavel on the last of his herd. 10 head. Not prime stock, not anymore. They were thin from a lean year, their ribs a sad accordion beneath their hides, but they were all he had left. The price they fetched was an insult, a pittance that wouldn't even cover the interest on the bank note, let alone the principal. The note was held by a man who smiled while he signed the papers, Virgil Claymore, a man whose prosperity seemed to grow in direct proportion to the misery of his neighbors. Thorn's pocket held the sum of his existence, a few wrinkled bills and a handful of coins. He could feel their insignificant weight against his thigh, a cold, metallic reminder of his absolute ruin. His father, a man carved from the same hard earth he worked, had built the Shepherd Ranch from nothing but grit and a belief in the promise of the land. He died in the arms of that same land, leaving Thorn not just the deed, but a silent commandment. Hold on to this. Thorn had tried. God, he had tried. He'd worked until his hands bled, prayed for rain that never came, and fought against a market that seemed rigged to break the small man. And now, here he was, broken. The mocking crowd was a blur of faces, a shifting kaleidoscope of pity and scorn. He saw their whispers in the tightening of their lips, their judgment in the quick, dismissive glances. They were the jury, and the verdict was in. Thorn Shepherd was a failure. He was a ghost haunting the memory of a better man, a hollowed-out son who was about to lose his birthright. His gaze drifted from the auction block to the periphery, where the dregs and the unwanted gathered. Tucked away near a water trough, a man with desperation etched into every line of his face was trying to sell a dog. Not sell, really, more like plead. The man was Cassidy Flynn, a drifter who'd lost his farmstead a season ago. The dog was a creature of profound unsightliness. It was a scruffy, dun-colored mutt, one ear permanently cocked at a quizzical angle, the other flopped down over a weary eye. Its coat was a mess of burrs and mange, its ribs as prominent as Thorn's own cattle. The dog lay in the dust, as listless and defeated as Thorn felt, a discarded thing in a world that only valued polish and provenance. Flynn was asking for $5, his voice a hoarse crackle. "He's a good dog," he'd say to anyone who slowed their pace. "Loyal. Just, I can't feed him no more." No one slowed. They saw what Thorn saw, another piece of worthless scrap. Yet Thorn couldn't look away. In the animal's dull, amber eyes, he saw a reflection of his own soul, beaten, overlooked, and about to be cast out. He was nothing. The dog was nothing. They were two sides of the same tarnished coin. The crowd's laughter from the auction stand rolled over him, sharp and cruel. Virgil Claymore had just purchased a prize bull, his voice booming with self-satisfaction as he clapped his cronies on the back. He was a pillar of the community, a respected merchant whose store provided credit and supplies. He was also the man who held the note on Thorn's land, the man who would own it by the end of the week. Claymore glanced over, his eyes, small and shrewd, finding Thorn by the fence. A slow, pitying smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a vulture circling a dying animal. That smile was the final spark on the dry tinder of Thorn's pride. An impulse, hot and irrational, surged through him. It wasn't a thought, not a plan. It was a prayer flung into the void, a final act of defiance against the crushing weight of his reality. He pushed himself off the fence, his boots crunching in the thick dust, and walked not toward the road home, but toward Cassidy Flynn and his pathetic dog. The coins in his pocket felt suddenly heavy, not with their lack of value, but with the weight of this single, meaningless choice. Flynn's eyes widened as Thorn approached, a flicker of hope warring with the certainty of another rejection. $5? Thorn's voice was rough, unused. Flynn nodded, swallowing hard. He's a good dog. Name's Copper. Thorn looked down at the animal. Copper didn't even lift his head, just shifted his gaze, a slow, weary roll of his amber eyes. He seemed to be conserving the very last of his energy. He smelled of dust and neglect. Thorn knelt, the motion stiff, his joints protesting. He extended a hand, calloused and scarred from years of mending fences and pulling calves. He laid it on the dog's mangy head. There was no tail wag, no lick, just a slight, almost imperceptible lean into the touch. A silent acknowledgement. An acceptance of fate. It was a feeling Thorn knew all too well. He dug into his pocket, his fingers closing around the entirety of his worldly wealth. He pulled out the crumpled bills and the few coins. He counted them out. $7 and change, more than enough. He handed a $5 bill to Flynn. The man took it as if it were a sacred relic, his fingers trembling. "Thank you," Flynn whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "You take care of him. He's better than he looks." He untied the frayed rope that served as a leash and handed it to Thorn, avoiding his eyes. Then, without another word, Cassidy Flynn turned and vanished into the crowd, a man unburdened of his last loyalty, free to drift away on the winds of his own misfortune. Thorn was left kneeling in the dust, holding a rope attached to a creature the world had deemed worthless. The purchase was an act of madness, a squandering of his last few dollars on something that could offer no return. He had bought a mirror. He had bought a companion for his own misery. He stood up, tugging gently on the rope. The dog, Copper, rose with a sigh, a slow, creaking unfolding of limbs, and stood by his side, head bowed. A wave of scornful laughter rippled through the nearby crowd as they noticed the transaction. Virgil Claymore, his face flushed with victory and whiskey, strode over, his polished boots kicking up puffs of dust. He was flanked by two men who looked like they'd been hewn from the same block of granite. "Well, well, Shepherd," Claymore boomed, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "I see you're investing in your future. Can't afford to keep your cattle, so you buy a half-dead cur? Is that the new Shepherd brand of ranching?" His cronies chuckled. The circle of onlookers widened, drawn to the spectacle of a man being kicked while he was down. Thorn's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like the whining of a beaten man. He stared at a point just past Claymore's shoulder, focusing on the shimmering heat rising from the packed earth. "What did you pay for that mess?" Claymore pressed, gesturing at Copper with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Whatever it was too much. Some things, Shepherd, are just meant to be thrown away. You ought to know that better than anyone." The insult landed, sharp and deep. He wasn't just talking about the dog. He was talking about Thorn, about his ranch, about his father's legacy. Thorn's hand tightened on the rope leash, his knuckles white. The shame was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread from his neck to his ears. And then, something shifted. It wasn't him. It was the dog. Copper, who had been standing with the lifeless apathy of a condemned prisoner, suddenly went rigid. His head lifted. The flopped ear twitched, then perked up, joining its mate in a state of sharp, focused attention. His body, which had been a study in slack dejection, now quivered with a low, intense energy. A soft growl rumbled in his chest, a sound so low it was more felt than heard. Thorn looked down, startled. The dog's amber eyes, once so dull, were now fixed on Virgil Claymore's wagon, parked just a few yards away. They weren't just looking, they were burning, lit with a sudden, preternatural intelligence. Claymore hadn't noticed. He was too busy playing to the crowd. "Look at that," he sneered. "It even growls. Probably rabid. You'd be doing the town a favor to put it out of its misery, Shepherd. And maybe yourself, too." But the growl wasn't for Claymore. It was for the wagon. Before Thorn could react, Copper lunged. The frayed rope snapped from Thorn's hand. The dog shot forward, not with the frantic, clumsy energy of a normal cur, but with the guided missile purpose of a predator. He ignored Claymore, ignored the crowd, and launched himself at the rear axle of the merchant's sturdy buckboard wagon. The crowd gasped, then fell into a stunned silence. Mockery turned to bewilderment. Copper began to dig. His paws, which had seemed so listless just moments before, became twin engines of excavation, throwing claws full of packed earth and gravel into the air. He wasn't just scratching. He was tearing at the ground with a desperate, focused fury, his entire body trembling with the effort. "What in God's name?" Claymore sputtered, his face losing its smugness, replaced by a flicker of confusion, and then alarm. "Get that damned animal away from my wagon!" One of his men moved to kick the dog, but Thorn stepped in front of him, his body a sudden, unyielding wall. "Leave him be," Thorn said, his voice quiet but laced with a new, unfamiliar steel. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this was not random madness. This was important. Copper's frantic digging was punctuated by a sharp, metallic clink. The dog stopped, panting, and began pulling at something with his teeth. He backed away, dragging a small, heavy metal box from a cleverly concealed compartment welded to the underside of the wagon, nestled right against the axle. The box, coated in dust and grease, was unremarkable, but its presence where it shouldn't be silenced the last of the murmurs. The air grew thick with a new kind of tension, not mockery, but a sharp, hungry curiosity. Claymore's face had gone the color of spoiled milk. Panic flashed in his eyes, raw and unguarded. That's just a toolbox," he stammered, his voice suddenly thin, full of bolts and spare parts. But his voice lacked conviction, and the way he stared at the box betrayed him. Copper, as if understanding the lie, nudged the lid of the box with his nose. It was latched, but not locked. The latch, jostled by the rough extraction, sprang open. The lid fell back with a heavy thud, and the collective gasp of the crowd was like the wind being sucked out of the world. It wasn't filled with bolts. It was filled with gold. Not coins, but small, heavy ingots of raw, unrefined gold, shimmering with a dull, malevolent light under the harsh afternoon sun. They were the unmistakable product of a syndicate that had been plaguing the territory for months, hitting prospectors and isolated mines, their mark, a crudely stamped serpent, visible on the top ingot. The same gold that had been stolen from a dozen men, some of whom were standing right there in the crowd, their faces now masks of dawning, furious comprehension. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where all sound and breath had ceased to exist. In that silence, the truth rearranged itself. Virgil Claymore, the pillar of the community, the respected merchant, the man who held their debts and their futures in his ledger, was a thief. A common, greedy thief, hiding his ill-gotten gains beneath a veneer of respectability, driving it right through the center of town under their noses. The mockery that had been aimed at Thorn now curdled and turned, silently, unstoppably, toward the man in the polished boots. Virgil Claymore, exposed by a mangy dog, stood frozen in a spotlight of public judgment, his carefully constructed world crumbling to dust around him. Sheriff Morton pushed through the crowd, his face a grim, weary mask. He was a just man, but the world had long since scraped the optimism from his soul. He looked from the gold in the box to the ashen face of Virgil Claymore, then to Thorn, and finally down to the panting, dusty dog who sat proudly beside his discovery. Morton's eyes, which had seen every kind of human ugliness, held a flicker of something that looked almost like wonder. He didn't need to ask what had happened. The scene told its own story, more eloquently than any witness. "Virgil," the sheriff said, his voice flat and final. "Looks like your accounts are about to be audited." Claymore didn't resist. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by the hollow shock of total ruin. As the sheriff led him away, the crowd erupted. The silence shattered into a storm of curses, accusations, and the raw, hungry shouts of men who saw their stolen fortunes returned. They swarmed the wagon, their earlier scorn for Thorn forgotten, replaced by a greedy, desperate awe. Thorn's shepherd, the failure, the pariah, had become the agent of a public miracle. He stood beside Copper, a still point in the swirling chaos, his hand resting on the dog's head. The animal's fur was coarse and dirty, but beneath his palm, Thorn could feel the steady, loyal beat of a heart that was worth more than all the gold in that box. He had spent his last few dollars on a worthless dog, and in return, the dog had uncovered a hidden truth, shattering a false idol and, in the process, changing everything. The whiplash of fortune was a dizzying, nauseating thing. One moment, Thorn was the town joke. The next, he was its reluctant hero. Sheriff Morton, after securing Claymore and the gold, had clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of respect that felt as foreign and strange as the wad of cash he then pressed into Thorn's hand. There was a substantial reward for the recovery of the syndicate's gold, a sum that made Thorn's head swim. It was more money than he had ever seen in his life. Enough to pay off the fraudulent note on his ranch a dozen times over, enough to buy prime breeding stock, hire hands, drill a new well, enough to rebuild. "The town owes you a debt, Thorn," Morton had said, his voice gruff. "You and that dog of yours." Thorn had simply nodded, the words caught in his throat. He felt the eyes of the crowd on him, no longer mocking, but filled with a different kind of intensity. It was awe, yes, but it was mingled with something else: envy, greed. He saw it in the way they looked at the money in his hand, the way their gaze darted from him to the dog, as if trying to calculate the animal's worth. He had gone from being invisible to being a spectacle, a target. The shame of poverty had been replaced by the unease of sudden, unearned wealth. He felt a desperate need to escape, to return to the only place that felt real: his land. He bought a sack of grain, a slab of bacon, and a thick, meaty bone for Copper, the purchases feeling dreamlike and unreal. He loaded them onto his old wagon, the same one he'd used to haul his last cattle to market. Copper, no longer leashed, hopped onto the seat beside him, a quiet and constant presence. The journey home was a blur of dust and shimmering heat. The familiar landscape, usually a source of comfort, now seemed alien. Every rock and cactus seemed to hide a watching eye. The wind whispering through the sagebrush sounded like a covetous murmur. His father's words echoed in his mind, not the commandment to hold on, but a different, quieter warning he'd offered once. "Fortune is a heavy stone, son. Easy to find, hard to carry." As the sun began to bleed across the western sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and bruised purple, the outline of his ranch came into view. The small, clapboard house, the sturdy barn his father had raised with his own 2 hands, the corral. It was all still his. The relief was a physical wave, so potent it almost buckled him. He had not failed. He had been saved by a miracle in the shape of a mangy dog. But the relief was short-lived. As he drew closer, a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. A light was on in the house. A single yellow lamp glowed in the kitchen window. Thorn never left a lamp burning. It was a waste of oil he couldn't afford. He pulled the wagon to a halt 100 yards away, concealed by a small rise. His heart hammered against his ribs. Copper beside him was utterly still, his head cocked, his ears trained on the house. A low growl, the same one from the market, vibrated through the wagon seat. He wasn't growling at a wagon this time. He was growling at the house, Thorn's house. The reward money in his pocket suddenly felt like a brand, a mark that had painted a target on his back. The news of his windfall would have traveled on the wind, faster than any horse. He wasn't a poor rancher anymore. He was a man with a fortune, living alone, miles from town. A perfect victim. He slid from the wagon seat, his hand moving instinctively to the old hunting rifle he kept slung behind the seat. It was loaded, but he only had a few cartridges. He motioned for Copper to stay, a silent command the dog obeyed instantly, sinking down low, a shadow in the fading light. Thorn moved with the practiced silence of a man who knew every inch of his own land. He circled around the back of the house, using the cover of the outbuildings, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. He crept to the kitchen window, his body pressed flat against the wall, and risked a glance inside. 3 men were in his kitchen. They had made themselves at home. One sat at Thorn's table, leisurely cleaning his fingernails with a Bowie knife. He was a large, broad-shouldered man with a brutal face and cold, dead eyes. Thorn didn't know his name, but he'd seen him before, lingering on the edges of Claymore's circle, a shadow of menace. This had to be Burke. Another man was rummaging through his father's old roll-top desk, tossing papers onto the floor with careless disregard. The third was leaning against the counter, smoking a cigarette, a pistol resting comfortably on his hip. They were professionals, calm, confident, and deadly. They weren't here to ask for a share. They were here to take it all. The man at the table, Burke, spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried through the glass. "He ain't here. Took his sweet time coming back from town." "He'll be back," said the one by the counter. "Man like that, first thing he'll do is run home to gloat. He'll walk right in the front door." "Find the money," Burke ordered the man at the desk. "Claymore was a fool keeping that gold on him. This Shepherd fellow is probably just as stupid. Probably stuffed the reward under his mattress." The casual way they talked about him, about his home, sent a fresh wave of cold fury through Thorn. They had violated his sanctuary. They were turning his father's house into a tomb. He knew, with chilling certainty, that they would not leave him alive. He was a witness, a loose end. His new luck wasn't a gift. It was a death sentence. He backed away from the window, his mind racing. He couldn't take them on. 3 armed men, and him with 1 rifle and a handful of shells. A direct assault was suicide. He needed a different ground to fight on. He needed an advantage. His eyes fell on the barn. It was his ground. His father's ground. Dark, familiar, filled with tools and shadows and 100 places to hide. It was his only chance. He retreated back to the wagon, his movements fluid and silent. Copper was waiting, a coiled spring of tense muscle. The dog knew. He could smell the danger, the alien scent of predators in their territory. Thorn grabbed his rifle and the sack of supplies. He gave Copper a low, urgent command. "Barn boy, go!" The dog didn't hesitate. He slipped from the wagon and moved like a ghost through the twilight, melting into the deeper shadows surrounding the barn. Thorn followed, his heart a cold, heavy drum in his chest. He slipped through the side door of the barn, the familiar smell of hay, leather, and earth washing over him. It was the smell of his entire life, and tonight, it might be the smell of his death. He barred the door behind him and moved into the vast cathedral-like darkness of the main bay. The terror was a living thing inside him, a cold serpent coiling in his gut. But beneath it, something else was stirring, a hard, defiant anger. They had taken his home. They would not take his life, not here, not on his father's land. He was no longer a victim of circumstance. He was a man with something to defend. He and the dog, the 2 worthless things, would make their stand here, in the dark. The midpoint of his trial had passed. The whiplash of fortune and terror had propelled him to this single defining moment. This was the point of no return. The barn was a cavern of familiar shadows, a fortress of memory. High above, the last vestiges of daylight filtered through the cracks in the roof, casting down thin, dusty spears of light. Thorn moved through the gloom with the certainty of a man walking through his own skin. He knew the location of every pitchfork, every coil of rope, every hay bale. He was not a warrior, but he was a rancher, and a rancher's life was a constant exercise in strategic thinking, mending a broken fence with scavenged wire, pulling a calf from a difficult birth, predicting the turn of the weather. His mind, sharpened by a lifetime of such problems, began to work, not with panic, but with a cold, desperate clarity. He found Copper waiting for him by the main ladder to the hayloft, a silent, amber-eyed sentinel. The dog looked from Thorn to the main barn doors, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. They were coming. Thorn placed a hand on the dog's head, a brief, silent communion. "We're in this together." The dog seemed to understand, pressing against his leg for a moment before melting back into the shadows near the stalls. Thorn climbed the ladder, his rifle slung over his back. From the hayloft, he had a clear view of the entire barn floor, including the massive front doors. It was the high ground. He didn't have to wait long. A heavy boot kicked the side door he had barred. The wood groaned but held. A curse, low and angry, drifted from outside. Then, silence. They were smart. They wouldn't make a frontal assault on a locked position. They would be methodical. Moments later, the huge, sliding barn doors began to creak open, pushed slowly from the outside. A rectangle of bruised twilight spilled across the dirt floor, silhouetting two figures, Burke and one of his henchmen. The third man was circling, Thorn guessed, looking for another way in. "Shepherd!" Burke's voice boomed, echoing in the cavernous space. "We know you're in here. We saw your wagon. Don't make this difficult. Just give us the money. We'll take it and go. You'll never see us again." It was a liar's promise, and they both knew it. Thorn remained silent, his body concealed behind a wall of hay bales. He watched them step inside, moving with a predatory confidence, their pistols held ready. They paused, letting their eyes adjust to the gloom. "Spread out," Burke ordered his man. "Check the stalls. I'll check the loft." This was his chance. Burke started for the ladder. Thorn had prepared for this. He had spent his few moments of grace positioning a heavy block and tackle that he used for lifting hay bales directly over the base of the ladder. A single thick rope, looped around a pulley, held the weight. The end of the rope was in his hand. He waited, his breathing shallow, his heart a frantic bird in his chest. He let Burke place one foot on the first rung. Then he let go of the rope. The heavy iron block plummeted, not with a crash, but with a sickening, wet thud. Burke cried out, a sound of pure agony, as the weight crushed his foot against the bottom rung of the ladder. He stumbled back, howling, his pistol clattering to the floor. The other henchman spun around, firing blindly into the loft. The shot went wide, splintering a roof beam far above Thorn's head. Thorn didn't hesitate. He scrambled away from the edge, crawling deeper into the maze of hay. "He's up here!" the henchman yelled, his voice tight with panic. He rushed to Burke's side, helping his boss limp away from the ladder. "Get the lantern from the house!" Burke snarled through gritted teeth, clutching his shattered foot. "We'll burn him out if we have to." The henchman ran out of the barn, leaving Thorn alone with the wounded, furious Burke. He could hear Burke dragging himself into one of the empty stalls below, trying to find cover. This was a temporary victory, nothing more. Soon they would have light, and soon the third man would find another way in. He had to keep moving, keep thinking. He crawled to the far side of the loft, to a small opening used for tossing hay down into a feeding trough. He peered through. Below him, the barn stretched out toward the back wall, and there, almost invisible in the darkness, was a small, trapdoor-like opening in the floor. The entrance to the root cellar. It was an old feature, dug by his grandfather. A small, stone-lined pit for storing potatoes and preserves through the winter. It was small, defensible, and had a heavy, solid wood door. He needed to get there. But the third man was still outside. As if summoned by the thought, a board creaked near the back of the barn. The third henchman was trying to pry open a sealed-up window. Thorn knew he had only seconds. He slung his rifle over his back and swung himself down from the loft, landing silently in the soft hay of the feeding trough. He was on the ground floor now, the vast space suddenly feeling claustrophobic and filled with unseen threats. He could hear Burke groaning in the stall. He could hear the prying at the back window. Suddenly, a low, urgent bark came from the far side of the barn. Copper. Thorn's blood ran cold. Had they found him? But it wasn't a bark of pain or fear. It was a distraction. It was a strategic call. The henchman at the window cursed and abandoned his task. "He's over here!" he shouted, moving toward the sound. Copper had drawn him away, giving Thorn the opening he needed. Thorn darted across the open floor, his feet silent, and reached the root cellar door. He pulled it open, revealing a square of absolute blackness and a steep, narrow set of stone steps. Just as he was about to descend, Copper came flying out of the shadows, a dark blur of motion. The dog shot past him and down into the cellar without breaking stride. Thorn followed, pulling the heavy door shut over his head. The world plunged into total, suffocating darkness. Above, he heard the henchman's confused shouts, then the return of the second man, his footsteps heavy. "The lantern," he heard one of them say. Then Burke's pained voice. "He's in here somewhere. Find him and kill him." Thorn and Copper were huddled together at the bottom of the steps. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and old potatoes. It was a tomb-like silence, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the frantic beating of Thorn's heart. He was trapped. He had traded the open space of the barn for a tiny, subterranean prison. He ran his hands along the stone walls, feeling their cold, unyielding reality. It was over. He had outsmarted them for a moment, but now he was cornered. He sank down onto the dirt floor, the rifle useless in his lap. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over him. He had fought, but it wasn't enough. He had come so far, only to die in a hole in the ground. Copper nudged his hand, a wet nose in the darkness, and then let out a soft whine. The dog then turned away from him, and to Thorn's astonishment, began to dig. Not frantically, like at the market, but with a steady, determined scratching at the packed earth in the corner of the cellar. Thorn's first thought was that the dog was just being a dog, digging a den out of instinct. "No, boy," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Not now." But Copper persisted, digging with that same uncanny purpose he had shown before. He wasn't just digging in the dirt. His claws scraped against something hard. Wood. Thorn's curiosity, a single flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness of his fear, was piqued. He crawled over, his hands searching in the dark. He felt the edge of something. A wooden plank. A loose floorboard? No, it felt different. It was the lid of a box. His fingers, clumsy with adrenaline, traced its outline. It was another metal box, just like the one under Claymore's wagon, but this one was older, the metal pitted with rust. It had been buried here under the floor of the root cellar for years. His father. This had to be his father's. Working by feel, he found a simple clasp and pried it open. The lid creaked back. His hands explored the contents. Not gold, paper, a thick oilskin-wrapped parcel. He knew with a sudden, heart-stopping certainty what it was. The original deeds to the ranch, his grandfather's letters, his family's birthright, the true inheritance, hidden away for safekeeping. His father had never fully trusted banks or people like Claymore. Tears pricked Thorn's eyes. He was holding his entire family history in his hands. But there was something else in the box, something hard and cylindrical, wrapped in waxed paper. He felt it, his fingers tracing its shape. It was a stick of dynamite, and then another, and another, a small, forgotten cache of blasting dynamite from his grandfather's time, used for clearing stumps and blasting rock. It was old, unstable, but it was here. Above them, he heard the heavy scrape of the cellar door being moved. They had found him. A sliver of lantern light cut through the darkness. "Nowhere left to run, Shepherd," came Burke's voice, thick with pain and malice. Thorn looked at the dynamite in his hands. He looked at the oilskin packet containing his legacy. Copper's digging. Each time, it had uncovered a truth. First, Claymore's false wealth. Now, his own true inheritance. And with it, a final terrible salvation. Fortune was not a gift, but a responsibility. And sometimes defending it required not just courage, but a terrible ingenuity. A plan, born of absolute desperation, exploded in his mind. He grabbed one of the sticks of dynamite. He had seen his father use them once, a long time ago. He knew about fuses. He knew about timing. It was a desperate gamble, a choice between certain death and a chance, however slim, at life. He would not die in this hole. He would rise from it. The lantern light widened as the door was fully opened. Thorn could see the silhouette of a man peering down. He didn't have a fuse, but he had the lantern. He had a flame. He tore a strip from his own shirt, his hands working with frantic precision in the near darkness. He wedged one end into the dynamite stick, creating a crude, fast-burning fuse. He clutched the oilskin-wrapped deeds to his chest. He looked at Copper. The dog was watching him, his intelligent eyes seeming to understand everything. "Get ready, boy," Thorn whispered. He took a deep breath, the earthy smell of the cellar filling his lungs one last time. He was no longer just Thorn Shepherd, the failed rancher. He was the guardian of a legacy, the partner of a loyal friend, and he was about to bring the whole damned world down on his enemies' heads. He held the stick of dynamite like a scepter, a symbol of his final desperate reclamation. The climax of his trial was at hand, not just a fight for survival, but a controlled, cathartic explosion that would either save him or bury him forever. The henchman started down the narrow stone steps, lantern held high. The light cast long, dancing shadows, turning the small cellar into a stage for the final act. Burke's voice echoed from above, a venomous command. "Drag him out. I want to look him in the eye." Thorn didn't wait. He scrambled to the far corner of the cellar, pressing himself against the cold stone, shielding the packet of deeds with his body. He held the dynamite stick low, the makeshift fuse ready. He gave Copper a final, silent command with his eyes. "Stay behind me." The henchman reached the bottom step, his pistol leveled. The lantern light illuminated his face, revealing eyes that were wide with bloodlust and greed. "It's over, rancher." "You're right," Thorn said, his voice surprisingly calm. In one fluid motion he lunged forward, not at the man, but at the lantern. He thrust the dynamite's fuse directly into the flame. It caught instantly, sputtering to life with an angry hiss, a small, furious star in the darkness. The henchman's eyes widened in disbelief, then horror. He had a split second to understand what was happening before he reacted, not with violence, but with pure animal terror. He shrieked and scrambled backward up the steps, dropping the lantern, which clattered to the stone floor and went out, plunging the cellar back into near total darkness, save for the rapidly shortening fuse. Thorn didn't throw the dynamite. That was the plan of a fool. A full explosion in this confined space would have brought the barn down on top of them, burying them all. His plan was more precise, more strategic. The root cellar was old, built with a ventilation shaft, a small, stone-lined tunnel about a foot in diameter that led up and out to the far side of the barn, designed to keep the air from stagnating. It was his only way out. "Now!" he yelled to Copper. He shoved the sputtering dynamite not up, but sideways, into the base of the stone steps the henchman was frantically climbing. He wedged it deep into the earthen foundation beneath the stones. His gamble was that the blast would be directed and contained, not collapsing the ceiling, but blowing out the stairwell, creating a wall of rubble and confusion. He grabbed Copper by the scruff of his neck and half threw, half pushed him toward the ventilation shaft. The dog, trusting him completely, squeezed into the narrow opening. Thorn followed, wriggling into the tight, dark tunnel, scraping his shoulders and back on the rough stone. He pushed the precious oilskin packet ahead of him. Behind him, he could hear the panicked shouts of the men above as they realized what he'd done. He was only halfway through the shaft when the dynamite went off. It wasn't a deafening Hollywood explosion, but a deep, gut-punching crump that shook the very foundations of the earth. The world behind him dissolved into a roar of collapsing stone and dirt. The pressure wave slammed into him, forcing the air from his lungs and momentarily deafening him. Dust and debris filled the tunnel. For a terrifying moment, he thought he had miscalculated, that he was about to be buried alive. Then it was over. Silence rushed back in, thick and ringing. He was alive. He pushed forward, crawling over loose dirt that had been forced into the shaft, and finally tumbled out onto the barn floor on the far side, gasping for air, covered in dirt and grime. Copper was already there, shaking the dust from his coat. The air in the barn was thick with dust, making it impossible to see more than a few feet. The root cellar entrance was gone, replaced by a crater of collapsed earth and shattered stone. The stairwell had been completely obliterated, trapping Burke and his men on the other side of the fall. He had cut them off, but he knew it wasn't over. The third henchman was still somewhere in the barn. Thorne grabbed his rifle, his ears still ringing. He could hear Burke screaming in rage and pain from the other side of the rubble, his voice muffled. Thorne and Copper moved as one, a seamless team, using the thick dust cloud as cover. They were no longer prey. They were hunters in their own territory. A figure emerged from the dust cloud near the stalls, coughing, his pistol raised. It was the third man, the one who had been trying the back window. He was disoriented, blinded. Copper saw him first. The dog didn't bark. He moved with silent, lethal speed, a dun-colored shadow launching itself out of the gloom. He hit the man low, at the knees, not with a bite, but with the full force of his body. The henchman cried out in surprise and pain, his legs buckling. He stumbled forward, his shot going wild into the rafters, and pitched face first into a water trough. Thorne was on him in an instant, the butt of his rifle coming down hard on the back of the man's head. The henchman went limp, his body slumping half in, half out of the water. One down. Thorne dragged him into an empty stall and bound his hands with a length of rope. Now for the other two. He crept to the edge of the rubble pile that had been the cellar entrance. Burke's cursing had subsided, replaced by the sound of coughing. "We're trapped!" he heard the second henchman yell. "The whole thing's caved in." "There's another way out," Burke growled. "The front! Move!" Thorne knew they would head for the main doors. He had one last trap to spring. Before the fight had even begun, he had run a tripwire, a thin, strong piece of baling wire, low across the main entrance, connecting it to a precariously balanced stack of old, heavy farm equipment. A rusty plowshare, a broken axle, a tangle of chains. It was a crude deadfall, but in the dark and the dust, it might be enough. He and Copper took up a position in the shadows, waiting. He heard them stumbling through the debris-strewn barn, Burke leaning heavily on his man. They were almost at the doors, silhouettes in the swirling dust. "Get the door," Burke ordered. The henchman, eager to escape, rushed forward. His boot snagged the wire. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting metal and wood, the entire pile of iron junk tipped over and came crashing down. The henchman didn't even have time to scream. He was buried under 100 pounds of rust and iron. Burke, a few feet behind him, managed to leap back, but a length of heavy chain whipped out and caught him across the legs, sending him sprawling to the ground with a cry of agony. His pistol slid away into the darkness. It was over. The barn fell silent, the only sound the slow settling of dust and Burke's ragged, defeated groans. Thorne stepped out of the shadows, his rifle leveled at the incapacitated man. Copper stood beside him, a low growl in his chest, his eyes fixed on their vanquished foe. Burke stared up at him, his face a mask of dirt, sweat, and disbelief. He had been beaten by one man and a mangy dog. The dust began to settle, literally and figuratively. The air cleared, revealing the carnage of the last hour, the collapsed cellar, the downed henchmen, the utter chaos of the barn. But it was a chaos of victory. Thorne stood over Burke, the rifle steady in his hands, not with the tremor of fear, but with the solid weight of conviction. He was no longer the desperate man from the market. The fire of the explosion had forged something new in him. As if on cue, the sound of an approaching rider reached them. A few minutes later, Sheriff Morton appeared in the open doorway, his face illuminated by the lantern he carried. He took in the scene with his weary, experienced eyes, the bound man in the stall, the one buried under the plow, Burke on the ground, and Thorn standing guard. "Sweet Mother of God," Morton breathed, lowering the lantern. "What happened here, Thorn?" Thorn's voice was hoarse, coated with dust. "They were waiting for me. They wanted the reward money." He gestured with the rifle. "This is Burke. I heard them say his name. He works for the same syndicate Claymore did." Morton knelt beside Burke, his expression grim. "I know who he is. We've been after his crew for months. They're the muscle behind the whole operation. Claymore was just their banker." He looked around the barn, at the evidence of a desperate, brilliant fight. "You did this? All of this?" Thorn looked down at Copper, who sat patiently by his side. "We did this," he corrected. The sheriff nodded slowly, a deep and profound respect dawning in his eyes. He looked at Thorn, then at the dog, and back again. He didn't need the details. The story was written in the rubble and the silence of the defeated men. It was the story of how a cornered animal and a man with nothing left to lose had found a way to fight back with courage and ingenuity. It was a story that would become a legend. Later, after the sheriff had secured the prisoners and hauled them away, promising they would face a justice from which there was no escape, Thorn was left alone in the quiet aftermath. The sun was rising, casting a soft golden light through the open barn doors, illuminating the floating motes of dust like tiny, shimmering jewels. The barn was a wreck, but it was his wreck. The house had been violated, but it could be cleaned. The land, his land, was safe. He walked back to the spot where he had emerged from the ventilation shaft. Kneeling, he gently retrieved the oilskin-wrapped packet. His hands were trembling now, the adrenaline finally leaving him. He carefully unwrapped it. There they were, the original deeds, signed in his great-grandfather's elegant script, letters from his father, full of hope and hardship, a faded photograph of his parents on their wedding day, standing in this very barn. This was the real treasure. Not the gold, not the reward money, but this, the proof of his roots, the testament to his legacy, true value hidden beneath the earth, waiting to be rediscovered. He stood and walked to the barn doors, the papers clutched in his hand. Copper padded silently beside him. They stood together, looking out at the rising sun painting the eastern hills. The land spread out before them, peaceful and quiet. It was no longer a burden, a symbol of his impending failure. It was a promise, a responsibility he had earned the right to keep. He was no longer just a rancher counting his losses. He was a guardian, a defender of a legacy he now fully understood. He looked down at Copper. The dog looked back up at him, his amber eyes clear and steady. There was no need for words. A silent, unbreakable understanding passed between them. They had been two worthless, discarded things, brought together by a desperate prayer in the dust of a cruel market. They had faced down shame, greed, and violence. They had survived. In the quiet morning light, with the deeds to his past and future held safely in his hand, Thorn Shepherd felt a sense of peace settle over him, a peace that was harder earned and more profound than any he had ever known. He had not simply found a fortune. He had forged one, built not from gold, but from loyalty, courage, and the simple, enduring truth that the most valuable things in this world are the ones others are too blind to see. They were a legend now, he and the dog, a story that would be whispered across the territory, a legend built one splinter, one scar, and one act of unbreakable trust at a time.